So, welcome everyone to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. We are bringing you conversations with principled, innovative leaders who improve the world. And we are joined today by Nelson Repenning, who is the faculty director of the MIT Leadership Center and the School of Management Distinguished Professor of System Dynamics and Organization Studies here at MIT Sloan. So we are excited to have Nelson with us today, and of course, want to offer our congratulations on the recent publication of his book, There Has Got to Be a Better Way, with co-author Don Kieffer, also from MIT Sloan. And the book explores the research and practice of dynamic work design, which we will learn more about today. And I will add a plug, the book is on sale. So everywhere you like to purchase your books, please, I encourage all of you to run out and get a copy today. So this conversation is kicking off our series for the fall with a focus on dynamic work design and system dynamics. So we will continue this theme for our next two webinars in October and November, featuring two alumni who are putting this into practice in their own work. So I'll drop those details into the chat as we get underway, and we look forward to seeing you online then. For today's session, we have prepared questions that were pre-submitted by our audience, and you can also use the Q&A panel in your Zoom interface to submit additional questions for Nelson during the conversation today. So it is my pleasure now to turn it over to Jackie Selby, Executive MBA Class of 2021, who will be moderating our session. So Jackie, take it away.
Thank you very much, Greg, and a special thank you to the Office of External Relations for your ongoing partnership in this series. It is a tremendous pleasure to welcome Professor Repenning to share his research, experiences, and expertise with us today on the heels of the release of his new book, There's Got to Be a Better Way. Over a decades-long career, Professor Repenning has developed the theory and practice of dynamic work design at MIT, which empowers corporations to dramatically improve productivity and employee engagement. And the book brings the principles of dynamic work design to life with numerous examples of successful workplace implementation. Professor Repenning, I know that I am not alone in saying that you had a profound effect on how I view organizations and the world, and it is truly a privilege for all of us to have you speak today and to have the opportunity to learn from you again. So thank you very much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks for having me. And I'm just looking at the chat, and a lot of very familiar names there, some that are blasts from the past. So it's great to see everybody, at least virtually. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I know we have a lot to cover, so we want to dive right into our questions. So I want to start with a little bit of a background. So your initial work as a PhD student focused on one question. Do the standard management tools taught in business school today actually have an impact on practice? And you determined that they fail more often than not because management fails to foresee negative consequences of new implementations, and they fail into a trap of crisis management. So could you talk a little bit about when you first identified this as a significant problem in organizations and started to focus on this as a line of research?
Yeah, sure. So I showed up at MIT on my 23rd birthday in August of 1991. Back then, System Dynamics was part of operations management. And I think, the origin story, or at this point, maybe origin myth of this line of research really was um, the hot topics back at that point were, I mean, what was really motivating a lot of work in operations management was the rise of the Asian manufacturers, particularly Toyota and Honda, and how much better they were doing than the big three US auto manufacturers. And most of my colleagues were PhD students and faculty were working on various elements of lean production and the quality management tools. And, because it was MIT, it tended to be extremely technically work, algorithms, decision support tools, and so on and so forth. Um, and, quite frankly, I didn't really feel like I could compete. I didn't know as much, thought I knew a lot of math till I got here. And then I realized there was a whole other level that I wasn't familiar with. And I just didn't feel like I could make a lot of progress relative to what other people were doing. But then working with John Sturman, who was my thesis advisor, we started looking at some case studies. And I think that's when we happened upon this question of, do people actually use these tools that we are spending so much time and energy developing? And it was motivated by a couple things. Number one, this was the early 1990s. The sort of quality related tools have been out there for at least a decade, and the US manufacturers were not even in the, same zip code as their Asian counterparts. So clearly something was going wrong there. But also, as I started doing field research, I kind of had the strange benefit of not having a lot of work experience, and so wasn't acculturated in how big organizations actually worked. And as an outsider who didn't really understand what was going on, it was just shocking how many books people had on their shelves that had great ideas in them that people weren't using. And so that's really where the question came out, or how I came upon it. And it's really the only one I've worked on essentially ever since. And then the only other wrinkle to this is that many years later, I started working in high hazard industries, particularly in the oil and gas industry, and working on a couple different accident investigations. And there, this gap between what we know and what we do was truly shocking, because what's required to run an oil refinery safely is pretty well known. There's thousands of books on it and experts, and you can get degrees in it. And when you do an investigation into a major accident, what you find over and over again is that it's not the fancy stuff that gets people in trouble. It's the inability to do the basics on a regular basis. And that was definitely the thing that really seared this in my head, is this is an important
Absolutely.
topic to work on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. And kind of digging into that a little bit more, as you mentioned, you also studied system dynamics under Jay Forrester. So could you talk a little bit about how just the systems training and systems thinking shaped the way that you view organizations and how it helped you to think about dynamic work design?
Yeah, and I think it's in two ways. I mean, number one, and I just had this conversation with John Sturman recently. There's not a single cause loop diagram or formal model in the book, and yet I think it's a deeply feedback-oriented activity. And one of the big insights I had, or the experiments I wanted to run, is in the field of system dynamics. We have often thought that the way to make organizations work better is acknowledge that organizations are really complicated places and give people tools to manage that complexity more effectively, largely through drawing diagrams and building models. I think what John and I tried to do in the book is sort of turn that on its head, which is basically to give people a set of tools and design principles so that people could make their organizations simpler, and
Mhm.
simpler in ways that interact with our cognition a little bit more effectively, so that maybe we don't need as much of these fancy analytic tools. And then I would say the other thing that influenced me, particularly from Jay and anyone who has any contact with him or his writings, is it's always been very important in the field and to me to make a difference in real problems. And that was something that was just ran through his every fiber of his being. And, I hope I inherited some small amount of that from my own work.
Oh, you absolutely did. So digging in then to dynamic work design. So this originated in 1996 at Harley Davidson as a result of some of the work that you actually, sorry, not some, the large part in the work that you and Don Kieffer did to help the organization really improve their product development process. And since then, you've done this for numerous other companies. So what did you see at Harley Davidson that made you excited about pursuing this new line of research?
I think there were two things, which is the origin of that was John Sturman and I, this is when I was a PhD student and later young faculty member, we had an NSF grant to support some research. And at the time, for this particular grant program, you had to have industry partners in order to apply for the money, which was a very novel idea for NSF at the time. And at a meeting, Harley had raised its hand and said, "We'd love to work with you." And so part of the appeal was just it was a really cool company. It was very fun to go on site visits. But I think the thing that really sealed the deal there is that when I met Don Kieffer, he was really just a kindred spirit in terms of a really relentless drive to try to figure out how to do things to make their activities work better. And I think what Don and I bonded over is we wanted to know why stuff worked. So it wasn't enough to just say, okay, well, Toyota does this and Toyota does that, so we should emulate them. But we really wanted to dig deep and to understand the principles behind it so that Harley could craft, and then other organizations later, solutions that worked for them, that weren't just adopting the practices that came from somewhere else. So I think it was that spirit and, a little bit of the contrarian nature that attracted me to them. And then, Don and I have had a 30-year partnership that has been extremely productive, I think, for both of us.
Absolutely. So, and I'd like to turn a little bit and talk more about some of the elements of the book and elements of dynamic work design. So, one of which is maintaining a discovery mindset and personally witnessing the work that is being done in an organization. So, could you talk about kind of why those elements are so important to having successful kind of structured problem solving, as you call it?
Yeah, so I think Don and I confronted a little bit of a paradox, which is the basic elements of structured problem solving have been around for centuries. And if you look at total quality management and Six Sigma, they've been repackaged many times for the world outside the lab. And almost everyone who's a member of a large organization has probably had some training in some kind of structured method, right? And it's basically what you learned in the sixth or seventh grade science class. But the thing that Don and I discovered is that in many cases, people knew the steps, but they were using them in such a rote or ritualistic fashion that they weren't getting any of the benefit out of them. They were kind of checking the boxes, either literally or metaphorically. And so in the book, we coined this idea of the discovery mindset, which essentially was what was the attitude that you needed to have in order to take full advantage of what the structured problem solving tools had to offer. And essentially, what it boils down to is, I think, some intellectual humility in the sense that the reason the tools work is because the systems that most people work in are so complicated that no one could design them perfectly the first time. And in most cases, there's not a single person who knows everything about how it works. And once you kind of accept that, then your job really changes to constantly being able to try to discover sort of the next way to make things better. And I think once you have that attitude, then you can really take full advantage of the basic elements of the structured problem solving techniques. And I'm basically agnostic on which one that you use, whether it's Six Sigma or the lean version or whatever. I think if you have the discovery mindset, you can squeeze a lot of gains out of whichever version, your organization happens to prefer.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So in the book, you also talk about how working quickly to get things done unwittingly leads many organizations to a better before worse firefighting trap. So could you elaborate on how kind of a lack of immediate feedback in the system kind of leads to this problem, and how do you kind of recommend rectifying it?
Yeah, so this was the work I did earliest, and I think pretty much everyone who's ever been a student in my class has been regaled with some version of firefighting and capability traps. But back to the problem that I started working with, which is why don't people use tools that we would all agree are good things to do? Basically, the argument that has come out of my research over and over and over again is that using those tools interacts with our cognition and with our organizational structures in a particularly unhelpful way. And what it essentially boils down to is that if you look at how humans learn, we tend to be pretty effective learners when there's a short time delay between action and outcome. So I touch a hot stove, I burn myself, I learn pretty quickly not to do that. And in contrast, when there's a long delay between taking an action and getting an outcome, it's just much less likely we'll ever learn those two things are connected, particularly at the automatic or sort of habitual level, right? And so this is why it takes conscious energy not to eat that piece of cake or go to the gym because we don't get an immediate sort of benefit from doing that. And it's, kind of difficult to make yourself do that. When you try to use a new tool, process or whatever, almost always things are going to get worse immediately because you're not very good at it and you have to learn how to, integrate it with the rest of your organization. And the benefits will only come with a delay. And that's just a hard situation for us to learn the right lesson in. There's lots of examples of this, but a very simple one is if I have a well-functioning maintenance program in my factory, if I cut back on it, in the short run, things get better, right? I save money, I don't have to take equipment down. My results definitely improve. But of course, in the long run, if I'm not maintaining my equipment, it's all going to break. But that asymmetry between the good parts happen right away and the bad parts only happen with the delay tends to bias us very much towards the short term. And we tend to underinvest in things in the long run. And so we call this either the capability trap or firefighting. And I would say that Don and I and many of the students who I've worked with over the years have seen some flavor of this dynamic in almost every organization we've ever worked with. If you go back to the energy industry and some of the accidents I've helped investigate, that's probably the most acute version of that. Because what happens in that industry is it turns out you can do it wrong, meaning to skimp on safety and maintenance for a really long period of time, and you get heavily rewarded for it, right? Your earnings go up, your stock price goes up, and so on. But then when something bad happens because of the risk profile of that industry, they tend to be pretty ugly. Again, we see versions of this in other places that fortunately are much less acute, but still have that same flavor. So how do you work around it? Um, in some sense, this is what the book is about. But I think if there's a sort of central theme of all that we argue is that basically what we think people need to do is to rethink how they think about organizational change. In most large organizations, change is typically thought of as this kind of very disruptive episodic phenomenon where every 18 to 24 months we do a massive reorganization and we hire an expensive consultant to come help us. And, we print up t-shirts and coffee mugs and three-ring binders and so on and so forth. And they almost never work because you get a huge worst part. And in most cases, people abandon the core elements before they see the benefits. If you take dynamic work design seriously, the basic idea is we want change to be something you do in little bite-sized pieces every day rather than every 1.5 to 2 years. And when you do that, there's a lot of desirable properties that tend to follow. And so we think for most contexts, that tends to work a lot better and will help kind of get you out of that short-termism mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So kind of building upon that, feedback loops are an incredibly powerful driver in organizations. And dynamic work design ensures that the right feedback loops are in place, and by clearly articulating the work that needs to be done and also engaging everybody in that process. Could you talk a little bit about how dynamic work design makes that possible?
Yeah, and I think again, this comes to my sort of core insight about different ways to do system dynamics. So as I said, when I sort of grew up in the field, basically what we were supposed to do and what we tried to do with our students was give them a set of tools to understand the complexity of the environments that they were in, which I still think is a very important line of inquiry, but kind of in the spirit of working both ends against the middle, I think what dynamic work design tries to do is rather than change the people, let's change the environment in which they work and create a setting in which they are more likely to learn the right lessons from experience. And so, as I said, I think the idea behind feedback loops runs throughout the book, even there's not a single causal loop diagram in there. And to give you a sort of sense of how that looks, one of our other principles is what we call structure for discovery. And the basic idea there is in many cases, I think managers never think about what does a rank and file or a line worker learn on a day-to-day basis. Like if I just put you in your job, Jackie, right, with no training and you have your various incentives and your various activities, what do you actually take away from that? And what we've discovered is that in many cases, people learn exactly the wrong lesson as to what drives performance. Or another thing that happens is you might have 10 people doing the same job, but because of the idiosyncrasies in their experience and the kinds of customers they deal with or the kinds of problems they solve, they all may learn to do that job in a slightly different way. And then when I put all 10 of you together, it doesn't add up to what you want. And so the essence of that principle is really a charge to think very carefully about what does someone learn on a day-to-day basis from doing the actual work. And in many cases, by creating simple checklists or improving the metrics or just having a daily meeting, you can dramatically improve those learning processes so that people are kind of on the right trajectory that you would want. Another example of a feedback loop that is really embedded in dynamic work design, and again, I see a lot of former students on the list here, so you've all heard me go on about this. Most organizations take on way too much work, right? They put in too many products in their portfolio, they have too many customers, and so on and so forth. And what's missing there is a feedback loop that would tell you, oh, wait, we've taken on too much work and we're starting to suffer some of the costs of this. And so we go on at some length in the book about simple techniques for visualizing the work so that if you can see how much you've signed up to do, hopefully that will have a natural feedback effect that would say, okay, wait, I have enough going on here. Maybe I need to back off a little bit so that we don't overload the organization.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I kind of in building upon one of your comments earlier about kind of connecting humans and having them kind of do the same work and be working in the same fashion. You talk about in the book connecting the human chain, which empowers people to complete their tasks and collaborate effectively while still being able to identify the triggers that require escalation points. So could you talk a little bit more about that and how that's important and why?
Yeah, I think so. This is an interesting case where I think for Don and I think we often have the pieces of the puzzle long before we see the big picture. And this is one that snapped into place, I think, relatively late. So one of the techniques that Don had developed in his work at Harley, and then with some assistance from me, was just going through the chain of people who were doing the work and making sure that if I produced work that you needed, that the outputs of my work actually equaled the inputs that you needed. And so we often ask our students just to draw little stick figure pictures where, we have Nelson, then we have Jackie, then we have Greg, and let's just make sure that the outputs of one equal the inputs of the other. This would seem like the most basic requirement that every piece of work would satisfy. And in fact, it's routinely violated. People produce things all the time that nobody uses. And then on the flip side, right, I might be supposed to get information that I need for my work from you, but I don't get it, or I don't get it half the time, or, it has errors. And so the first part of connecting the human chain is just to make sure that when you have this sequence of people who touch the work, each person is producing what the next person needs. And then where feedback comes in is that in many cases, let's imagine that I don't give you the inputs that you need, right? There should be some kind of signal that says, oh, wait, Nelson didn't produce what Jackie needs to do her work. But again, in most cases, that is missing. And so there's no learning process where over time we would evolve to a place where I'm producing exactly what you need in order to get your work done. So that's part of it. And then the other thing that we sort of discovered along the way is if you can imagine there's a chain of people doing the work. So think of that as the horizontal chain. Then there's also a sort of vertical chain, which is the chain of people who supervise the work and might sort of check in on you to make sure that things are going well. And outside of the world of manufacturing, one of the things we've discovered is those sort of horizontal or oversight or management chains often are very poorly designed and are super haphazard. And as a sort of simple little role play that I do with my students all the time, you know, for anyone who's on this call right now, chances are at this very moment, someone who works for you is getting stuck, right? They've come across a piece of work that they don't know how to do, or a piece of information they don't have, or a question they don't know the answer to. When are you going to find out about it, right? And what often happens is that you're fighting the psychology a little bit because I don't really want to tell my boss that I don't know how to solve the problem. And so I think to myself, maybe if I just sleep on this, I'll sort it out. All of which basically combines to make an extremely random process about when important issues get escalated up the management chain. And so we created this concept of a trigger, which is basically a rule that just says when the problem is big enough, I now need to raise my hand and tell my boss that I need help. And I need to do it in a timely fashion. And we found that when you start to wire those chains together with those explicit triggers, information flows faster and problems get to the person who can solve it far more quickly than if you just sort of allow it to happen randomly, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And then there's one other final element to this, which is also sort of under the connect the human chain principle, which is one of the things that Don and I have discovered, and it took us a while to figure this out, is in many of the organizations we visit, we have gotten to the place where people are using face-to-face meetings, including Zoom, and then electronic communication like email and, Slack and instant messaging, almost exactly backwards. And what we mean by that is what's face-to-face communication good for? Well, it's good for processing ambiguity and transferring complex information, right? What's email good for? Well, it's good for transferring information that's very clear where it's unlikely to be ambiguous, right? So take a trip to the hospital as an example, right? I walk in, I fill out my form with my insurance information or whatever. That can be transferred electronically to my insurance provider or the doctor, right? There's not a lot of ambiguity there. At the same time, right, if my case is very complicated, right, I'd much rather have the nurse have a face-to-face conversation with the doctor or the next doctors rather than it go back and forth via email. But what you see in organizations all the time is that big meetings are typically one-way information transfer. So I stand up there for 55 minutes and I show you 400 slides and you nod your head, and then one person asks a softball question at the end. And then we go back to our desk and sit down and try to solve all the problems via email and Slack messages and so on and so forth. That is an extremely inefficient way to propagate information. And so, as one simple example, we often find that putting in one strategically placed meeting a day that's focused on problem solving can take hundreds of emails a day out of people's inboxes, which of course everybody is extremely happy about. And so there's a lot here in terms of how do we connect the humans doing work so that we get the information transferred in the most efficient way possible. And so, the advice I would say here is be extremely wary of your electronic communication media, particularly when you see a lot of iteration, right? So if you get emails that have, dozens of additions or your Slack threads are constantly full, there's probably some information in there that probably should go into a meeting rather than back and forth, sort of over the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great advice for sure. So I have our last question that we prepared, and then we will move into the live questions we received as well. We also received a number as people registered for the event. So we'll get through as many of those as possible. So last question is the ability for all members of an organization to clearly visualize the work that's being done is a critical part of dynamic work design. Could you discuss kind of the importance of tracking workflows in this manner and what makes for a successful visual board?
Yeah, so I think another big insight that Don and I had along the way is most of the major innovations in work design, with Agile being probably the one exception here, which we can come back to if people want to talk about that, have come in the domain of physical work. So largely factories, right? Sort of manufacturing and assembly. And in retrospect, it's actually kind of clear why that is, because it turns out physical work tends to give you much better signals when something has gone wrong, right? So my co-author Don was the plant manager for Harley's engine plant. They have a moving assembly line. If something breaks and the assembly line stops, gives you a very clear signal that something's gone wrong, and people are likely to walk over and say, "Hey, Jackie, what's going on? Why can't you get your work done?" Knowledge work has none of that, right? It does not tend to give you clear signals when it gets stuck. So if we go back to the little role play I mentioned earlier, right? If someone who works for you is getting stuck at this very moment, there's nothing about that work that would generate a clear visual signal that says, "Oh, hey, boss, you should get involved here because this person can't get their work done." Similarly, not only can you not see problems with knowledge work, but it's often extremely difficult to see how much work there is in the system at any given moment, right? Because it's spread in our email inboxes and to-do lists and Microsoft project files and so on and so forth. And so the essence of visual management is essentially to take all that knowledge work and give it some kind of visual representation. Right? Now, pre-COVID, we really liked the low-tech approach. So it was Post-its and markers and whiteboards. And, all my students know that I love Post-its more than almost any other physical object in the world, probably. And the basic idea is draw a picture of the process on your whiteboard using a marker. Maybe our product development process has 4 or 5 pages phases, excuse me, put every project on a post-it and then start just placing those projects in their appropriate location in the process so that you can see how much work is in the system and then meet in front of that board every so often so you can see whether the work is moving or not, right? It's a really pretty simple setup, but it works incredibly well because it solves the two problems that I think are so endemic to knowledge work, which is number one, you can see how much you actually have. Every time we've ever done this exercise with the company, the first thing they realize is they have 3 times as many projects in the portfolio as they're ever going to have resources to do. And this often leads to this sort of existential crisis of, oh, we've got to get rid of all these projects and we don't know what to do. But once they start taking work out of the system and they see the remaining work starts to move much more quickly, then they start to, see that this is a valuable exercise. And then the other big, big benefit is, oh, if that post-it hasn't moved for 2 or 3 weeks, that means there's a problem. And now we need to maybe bring some resources to solve it. So post-COVID, I think we had to give up on the fact that everyone was going to have post-its and whiteboards. There's a bunch of different digital tools out there, I think, that are quite nice. Trello is one that many people are familiar with that you can learn to use in about 30 seconds. And then the sophistication and the sort of startup costs grow from there. I think they all work pretty well. The trick is just to make sure you're respecting the principles that go with visual management, which is that you can see all the work in the system and you can see whether the work is moving or not moving. And if the work is not moving, that's a signal that, okay, we need to bring some more resources to bear to fix the problem. The last thing I would say about the digitization is visual management works great, but the magic is the quality of the conversation you have in front of the board, whether it's pencil and paper or the digital board, right? The magic doesn't lie in the representation, it lies in the conversations that it catalyzes. And so I think the risk of the digitization is people might say, well, Jackie, I'm really busy. I'm not going to come to the meeting today. I'll check the board when I get home at night. And that seems sensible, but the moment that people do that, the magic is really lost, right? So if you're going to use a visual representation, you really do need to carve out the time as a team to meet in front of the board on a regular basis. Now, whether that's daily or weekly will depend on the kind of work. But what will be the measure of a good visual representation is, do you have an improved quality of conversation, and does it allow you to allocate your scarce resources more effectively to the stuff that matters most to your organization?
No, those are really valuable points. Thank you for sharing them. Okay, let's move to the questions that we have received from our attendees. So the first is about your role as faculty director of the Leadership Center. So could you share what specific skills or mindsets that you recommend prospective students develop to become effective practitioners of dynamic work design?
Say that last part.
Effective practitioners of dynamic work design.
Oh, yeah. So I think just to give you a little backstory of this, I was raised in a scholarly tradition that tended to really downplay the effective leaders. So, the world I came from was very much what we say structural. So it was the environment that mattered much more than the individual leaders. And one of the reasons that I took the role was I had done enough work on the outside that after a while it became crystal clear that the scholarly tradition was not correct in this case and that leaders actually matter a lot. And so I think part of the reason I took it was just I want to have influence on what happens in organizations. You really have to think very carefully about what leaders really do. If there is a piece of advice from a leadership point of view in terms of using dynamic work design, I think the biggest one is, and there's several others I would give, but it's something that we emphasize in the book over and over again, is you need to make some time to go see how the work is actually done. And I know for senior leaders, this is hard, right? You're extremely busy. You've got lots of stuff going on. MBA students, when I talk to them all the time, I say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And say, well, I want to be a chief executive officer. And I always reply like, do you have any idea what that job entails? Like being a CEO is really hard and really time consuming. I don't think it's for everyone. But if you are going to be a leader, CEO or otherwise, the first thing I would say is you need to make time to see how the work in your organization is actually done. And for those of you that are EMBA students that are on the call, you know that we make you do this as part of your OLAB project. And actually, just last Friday, we had the results come back in class. And when people come back, their eyes are usually about this big. Karen's exactly right. Go see and assess. And it's really shocking because what's actually happening in your organization, particularly if you're a senior leader, and what you think is happening are often two enormously different things. And one of the pieces of advice we often give the students is when you go do your go see and assess, go see the work. If you're not embarrassed by what you find, typically it just means you're not looking closely enough. And people come back with some crazy stuff. We had quite a few great examples on Friday. But the thing I want to emphasize is the reason that you see some crazy stuff when you go see the work is not because you have bad people. It's actually just the opposite. It's because your organization is staffed by competent people who want to do the best they can. And when they come across poorly designed work, they just figure out how to get it done, right? So metaphorically speaking, they get out their duct tape or chewing gum or safety pens or whatever, and they just come up with the workaround to complete the work. The problem is that all those workarounds required to get the work done don't add up typically to results that anyone wants. So I think one of the most powerful things leaders can do is go see how the work actually gets done, talk to the people doing it. You'll learn a lot about how your organization actually works, and there will be a zillion opportunities to make small changes as a leader that will both make your organization work better and will engender a ton of commitment from the people doing the work because they're going to be so happy that someone actually cares about what's happening. And that really is the thing that I think can start the trajectory towards far better organizational performance.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So the next question is, what similarities and differences do you see with dynamic work design versus lean thinking, and then also versus agile practices?
So this is such a great question. And I think for many people who look at the book, they will definitely see elements of either lean or agile or other things that they have familiar with. And sometimes people say, well, this isn't new. It's just, agile or whatever. I think one of the things that Don and I really worked hard on, and I hope it comes through in the book, is we wanted to present a set of principles for designing work rather than a set of practices. And the reason that's such a big deal is that most of what happens in sort of management research that's focused on practitioners is documentation of best practices, right? So Toyota does this, or Google does this, or Facebook does that. And very often people will take that practice and they'll try to sort of plop it down in their organization exactly as it happens in the organization that it came from. The problem is that even if you're in the same industry and hire the same people, organizations have their own norms and their own cultures, and it is very unlikely that a practice taken wholesale from one place is going to work without modification if you put it somewhere else. And just to take an example, if you worked in the energy industry at all, there's one freeway in Houston, Texas, where it feels like all the major oil and gas companies are all on this same road, and people move back and forth from one to the other. They're literally just crossing the street. And yet, if you take a practice from Exxon and try to just put it down wholesale in BP or Shell, I promise you it's not going to be successful because despite their proximity, they are two very different companies with different cultures. So what that means is that when you decide to do something new in your organization as a leader, you are going to have to modify that to fit your local organization. This is why the principles are important, because if you understand why that technique works, right, then you can make modifications. And as long as that why is respected, hopefully you'll have some chance of it being successful. So I'll give you my favorite example from Agile. There's a lot of different flavors of it, but Agile software development often preaches a daily stand-up meeting. Right. So for 50 minutes, we're going to get together. I'll tell you what I did. You tell me what you did. We compare notes, talk about what we're going to do today. See you tomorrow. Okay? Works fabulously well in many software contexts. I can't tell you how many organizations I've been to, and they say, well, we have a daily stand up every morning. And I say, why? Well, because we're an agile organization. Okay? But the thing that they're missing is the principle here is that you should meet as frequently as the work requires you to talk about stuff, right? Daily works very well in software. In other cases, you may not need to meet daily. You may need to meet weekly or 2 weeks. In some cases, you need to meet more often, right? So what I want people to understand is the principle, right, which is what is face-to-face communication good for and how often do we need it, rather than the practice, which is the daily stand-up meeting. And so I think that's really the sort of critical piece is we wanted to understand why these techniques work. And so we sometimes think of the book as sort of a Rosetta Stone, if you will, that helps translate between the sort of different techniques that are out there so that each company or organization can understand the principles and come up with their own combination that works for their unique organization rather than just say, well, this is what Toyota did. And it's just not going to work as well for you as it did for Toyota because it's not tuned to your unique culture or context.
That's a really good point to remember. Absolutely. And we did receive a number of questions that were specific to organizations or industries. So, I think that's an important point to remember, of course. Okay, we also received a number of questions in regards to AI. But I think the next one kind of probably captures most of it. So, how do companies need to reimagine workflows and agents in the age of AI?
So this is such a great question. And Don and I had a little op-ed that came out in Fortune recently about this. Obviously, this question comes up every time anyone talks about anything right now. You can't walk 2 feet on MIT campus without, hearing AI mentioned in some flavor or another. And I feel like from my perspective that we've been through this before, right? And I'll take us all the way back into the 1980s, which is that was the period of time that robots were starting to get really popular in manufacturing. And in this little op-ed, we talk about how in the mid 1980s, the CEO of GM got up at one point and said, we are going to basically replace almost all the labor in our factories with robots, and that's how we're going to compete with Japan, right? So we're going to have essentially lights out factories. GM spent an enormous amount of money on this, billions of dollars, and it didn't work. And as we were doing research for this little piece we wrote, we found these really funny examples of where the robots were painting each other and they were welding the car doors shut. And the, totally automated factories were never competitive with the ones that had human beings in them. So it was basically a bust from GM's point of view. Now, the interesting wrinkle is fast forward to today, 40 plus years later, automation's everywhere in factories. So clearly they had the right idea, right? Which is robots were going to do a lot of the work now that humans were doing back then. So I don't think the idea was wrong. What was wrong was the implementation strategy, meaning that they tried to do it all at once. And I don't think that was ever going to work. And the reason is, connecting to something we talked about before, is every process in an organization is a mix of the formal process, the way that we wrote it down when we started, and then all those little workarounds that people have came up with in order to actually get the work done. And if you try to automate an entire process without understanding all those little details, for my money, you're just going to get yourself in trouble, right? And so I believe that is going to be the failure mode for AI going forward, which is, and you see this all the time in the popular business press, right? We're going to automate everything, right? AI is going to take over an entire process and we're going to have, lights out offices now rather than lights out factories. I don't think that's going to be a successful strategy. So I think a much more wise approach is to, as we talk about in the book, make sure you understand the work. So how does it actually flow through the organization? And then proceed incrementally. Use AI at the places in that workflow where it's going to be most effective, right? So this could be work that's really boring. It could be work that requires a really high degree of fidelity that humans just aren't good at. Find small places where you can run small experiments, understand how the AI interacts with the organization. And if you get some wins, then you can start to spread it incrementally. I have no doubt if we have this conversation, 20 or 30 years from now, AI will have touched, parts of our workflow that we can't even imagine today. But I'm also pretty confident that if you overuse it or try to use too much at once, you're going to get, it's not going to go well. And so I think proceeding incrementally, driven by what the work requires and driven by a deep understanding of how the work flows, is going to be a much more sustainable strategy in the long run and will get us to that future in a much less painful path.
I think that's really important and really wonderful point of view. So thank you for sharing. So next, one of the challenges that many leaders face is persuading executive management to move beyond short-term metrics and embrace the longer-term benefits that system dynamics can reveal, particularly around building organizational capacity and retaining talent. From your experience, what approaches or narratives have proven most effective in helping senior executives not only understand these dynamics, but also commit to acting on them?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and in some sense, it's the one that's dominated my a good chunk of my professional life. I mean, here's what not to do, whether it's dynamic work design or otherwise. Don't run into the executive office and said, "I read this fabulous book, and we need to become a dynamic organization, and so we're going to have 2-day offsites where everyone's going to learn the dynamic work design tools, and again, t-shirts and coffee mugs and the whole shoot match." That is not going to work. That sort of standard change initiative model has been proven to fail over and over and over again. And so, what I would suggest is, and this is exactly what we preach in our courses here at MIT Sloan now, is pick a problem, ideally one that's in your purview, whatever your sort of span of control is. It really works well to pick something in a excuse the slightly off-color language that everyone perceives as an enormous pain in their ass. So if there's some kind of process that just doesn't work and nobody wants to use it and everyone avoids it, that's a great first place to work. And then try to solve it, right? And pick a problem that's small enough that you can make progress fast. So, we often say 30 to 60 days. And if you really solve that problem and make things better and get some real results, then take just a little bit of those results and invest it in the next problem, and then the next problem, and the next problem. So I think you will make much more progress proceeding incrementally than you will with the big change initiative. So it could be a tiny part of a large issue. But if you generate real results, then you will start to get attention from more senior people like, well, hey, what's happening over there in Jackie's area that actually I think things are getting better. And now I'm getting the invoices back sooner. Or, this really painful process now is much less painful than it was before. I think you will, again, make much more progress proceeding that way than otherwise. And I will say with that, particularly for the senior leaders on the call, when you first start working that way, it will feel like you're working below your pay grade, right? You're going to be involved in the nitty-gritty details of work in a way that you may not have done in 5 or 10 or more years. And you're going to be thinking to yourself, like, why am I involved in this one little tiny piece of the process? I got big things to do because I'm, senior VP or chief executive officer or whatever. But I think you'll find that if you can kind of work through that, you will learn a lot about how your organization works, as I said earlier, and the change will start to be infectious because once people see you really making change, like things are actually getting better, it will start to spread like wildfire. And now the problem will be holding it back rather than trying to propagate it. And I get it's a little bit counterintuitive because we've all been really acculturated in this kind of, big sort of change initiative mindset. But I've seen it work in enough cases now that I'm pretty confident that that is the more sustainable way to start adjusting your organization.
A lot of sense. Thank you. The next question builds upon this to a degree. So, in your experience working with various different corporations, if there were objections to dynamic work design, what were those that were kind of most common, and how did you overcome them?
So I think the biggest one is exactly what the previous question sort of highlighted, which is, and I remember, I won't name any names, but a very senior executive from a very large oil company, as we were sort of pitching this approach, and he said, well, I'm not trying to fix one company or one site or even one process. I'm trying to fix a whole organization, right? So I think the objection is it just feels like it's slow and targeted, and maybe it's okay for a plant manager, a shift supervisor, but it's not effective for a chief executive officer. And I think for my taste, that view just misunderstands the role that senior executives have. And this is one thing I work on senior teams over and over and over again. which is I think senior executives often grossly underestimate the impact that their behavior has on the organization, right? One way that I often capture this is a friend of mine who was CEO of a big energy company once said, my jokes were never funnier than when I was chief executive officer, right? And what he was trying to get across is that everyone is looking at him or her to try to figure out what to do. And I think when senior people take the time to get involved in small problems, okay, maybe that problem's not going to make any material difference in their bottom line, but the example that they are giving to the rest of the organization is enormously powerful. And if you go back to high hazard organizations, the ones that really manage those risks well, the senior leadership are just meticulous about following good safety practices, even in places where, frankly, the risk isn't that big, but they're trying to communicate to the rest of the organization that these practices really, really matter. And so I think that that's the big problem is senior people feel like that they need to do big things because they have big jobs in order to be successful. And that's true in lots of cases. I don't mean to discount that. But if you want to make the first step towards building a more dynamic organization that is able to adapt and able to improve, you're going to have to carve out some small amount of time in your week to start getting involved in some of the nitty-gritty details. And I promise you, if you generate success, it will propagate much faster than you probably anticipate.
Absolutely. So the next question is one that came live, and so request to talk a little bit more about explicit triggers. So how can we discourage employees from saying, "I'm stuck today. I have plenty of other things to do. I will bring this with my manager, not today, but our next one-on-one meeting."
Yeah. So this is such a great question. And I will say that I think the triggers make this easier, but not necessarily easy. And I think the reason it makes it easier is the way to put in a good trigger is to bring the relevant parties in the room. So it might be the people doing the work and the supervisor, and just have a discussion, not when there's a problem at hand, but sort of prospectively when everyone's cool, calm, and collected, and just say, okay, when do you think this problem is going to be big enough that you should raise your hand and ask for help? And I think, if everyone's in the conference room and, the temperature is relatively low, you can usually typically come up with a pretty sensible set. Well, if we're 5% away from the target, or we're 10% away from the target, or if the risk gets to a particular size. And then I think if the person who has to live under the trigger has had a hand in setting it, then they are much more likely to follow it when that actual situation comes up where something goes wrong and they need to raise their hand. I think the alternative, which most organizations use, is they might say, look, Jackie, you're the engineer, and if you get in trouble, call me, right? And that, I think, then puts all the onus on you to decide when you're supposed to pick up the phone. And that's the situation where people would wait too long. So I think it'll work much better if you decide in advance and it's decided jointly, because once people feel like they've had a hand in setting the rule, they're much more likely to follow it in that case. And then the other thing, and this goes back to a very old but I think important story, when the Toyota style production first came to the US, everybody knows that in the Toyota scheme, you're supposed to pull the andon cord, right? Stop the production line when you see something go wrong. It used to exasperate the Toyota managers because the US auto workers would never pull the cord, right? There would be a defect that you could see going by and they still would step back. And so finally, what they did is they would have a supervisor stand next to the operator and they'd say, see that defect? Pull the cord now, right? And they just had to practice it enough times till the people doing the work realize, oh, wait, I'm not going to get in trouble if I pull the cord for stopping the line. And you may need to do that in your organization a little bit in the sense of once you put the triggers in place, you really need to make an effort so that when someone, does stop the work by raising their hand and say they need help, that they don't get punished. And in fact, they get real help. And in fact, maybe it's even celebrated that, hey, Jackie, thank you much for telling about a problem. Now we know it earlier and we can, do a much better job of dealing with it than if we waited another day or week or month or whatever it might be.
No, so that's a really good reminder. And kind of along those same lines, the next question is, it's great that you're suggesting to start small, but how do you keep the attention on it? How do you keep the light shining on the problems that you are working on? Because there's competition or competing competition for attention, and small initiatives have a delay before you see any success or kind of outcomes.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think there's a couple different strategies you can use with that, which is number one, particularly for your early efforts. Um, I think to the extent that you can pick a problem that everyone in the group finds is a huge impediment to getting their work done, or just as, again, a kind of huge pain in their ass, that will engender a lot of commitment, like, oh, we're finally going to fix this thing that we've just been dealing with for years. I think this is a place where visual management can help, right? So if you have one of the visual management approaches that we recommend all the time is what we call a problem board, which is really nothing more than a rank ordered list of the problems you're trying to solve. And then you use post-its to track how they're moving through the problem solving process. I think explicit rank ordering is really helpful because it creates much more clarity in the organization. Like, okay, this is the number one problem, and we're going to keep working on this one until we solve it, and then we'll move on to the next. Part of I think the dynamic that the question is highlighting is, okay, we work on this one for a while, and then we move on to the other one, but then we come back to this one, and then a third one crops up, and people can't, really stay focused. A problem board and the explicit rank ordering really helps keep those priorities clear, particularly if you can enforce the rule, like we are not moving to number two until we solve number one. And in the book, there's an example of using a problem board where they were able to take an approvals process from 120 days down to 20 days just by adding a little bit of um, structure along the way. And then I think the last element to making this is what all the OLAB students have experienced, which is we're really big on taking a problem and scoping it down to a small manifestation so you can make progress on it fast. Again, 30 to 60 days, because the person who answers the question is exactly right. Attention spans in organizations are very short. And if I say, well, I'm going to work on this problem for 18 or 24 months, and then we're going to, see if it works, it's just never going to happen, right? 65 different things are going to change. If you can say, okay, we're going to run an experiment for the next 45 days to see if we can, fix this particular part of the process, then at least you have a shot of maintaining people's attention. So make sure you bite off, small pieces that you can really chew and don't, scope it too largely, because then I think you are going to have a really hard time keeping people focused.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question, which is more about the book. So, what surprised you most while writing it? And what have you learned about your own mental models? What shifted for you lately?
Um, so that's a great question. I think the part that I'm finding surprising now is I'm beginning to read reviews and stuff like that. Is it's interesting what people anchor on, right? So I've sat in my office for 5 years with Don working on this thing, and we have fought about every possible subtlety and piece of sentence structure, down to the period and the comma and the semicolon and so on and so forth. And, so far, the thing that I think people are really anchoring on is the part about going to see the work and getting in touch with what happened, which is great. And then sometimes I feel like, well, but there's a lot of other great stuff in there too. So, I think I'm having to learn some lessons on what people pay attention to. And then I think the thing that I've really changed my mind about over the last, this has actually been going on a while, but for me it was a really big change, is I started out thinking that, and anyone who's heard me teach knows I make a big deal about this, is that when something goes wrong, it's always the fault of the design or the structure, not the people involved. And I still think that's true 95+% of the time. But I have been forced, with all the various outside work I've done, to take seriously that accountability doesn't matter. And you do very occasionally get a bad apple, and it's extremely important to have the process in place for dealing with that accountability and for performance managing or whatever you want to call it. Because you do occasionally get people that just don't want to follow the process. And those folks are enormously toxic, right? And I do think that they probably need to go work somewhere else. All that said, I do believe strongly that you need to do all the structural design things first so that you get a job well designed in which any normal person can be successful in. And then if a given individual chooses not to follow that, okay, now they probably do need to go work somewhere else. So I think the ordering matters a lot, but I've had to think hard about this and accept the fact that, you do occasionally get someone that doesn't want to follow the process, no matter how good a job you do. And, you need to have a process in place to deal with that. And that stretched my brain a little bit because I think I had been so steeped in that other mindset. But of course, the answer is both.
Okay. Well, Professor Penning, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your insights. I'll turn it over to Greg for just a couple final thoughts.
Well, thank you. My pleasure. And again, great to see so many familiar names in the chat. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Nelson. And congratulations again to you and Don on the publication of your book. And thank you for spending time with us today. For our viewers, thank you for joining us. When you close out of the event, you will see a survey appear on your screen. So please fill that out and let us know your feedback on today's session, as well as on our ongoing lineup of events for the fall. So again, please join us in October and November, and we will continue the discussion on dynamic work design and hear from our fellow alumni community. So thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.